The job posting seemed too good to be true: 6 months of solitude, decent pay, and all I had to do was maintain the Whitmore Mountain Resort during the off-season. After my divorce and the subsequent financial devastation, I needed the isolation as much as I needed the money. What I didn't need was what I found waiting for me in those mountains. I arrived at Whitmore on October 15th, just as the last of the autumn guests were checking out. The resort was a sprawling complex of log buildings connected by covered walkways, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines and jagged peaks. The main lodge was impressive, 3 stories of rustic luxury with massive stone fireplaces and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. The outgoing caretaker, a weathered man named Bill Henley, gave me a hurried tour of the facilities. He seemed anxious to leave, constantly checking his watch and glancing toward the darkening sky. "Storm's coming in tonight," he muttered, leading me through the maze of guest cabins scattered throughout the property. "You'll want to get familiar with the generator shed and the propane tanks. Power goes out frequently up here, especially in winter." We walked past the tennis courts, now covered with tarps, and the outdoor pool, already drained for the season. The silence was profound, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound your body makes. Our footsteps echoed off the wooden walkways, and I could hear my own breathing in the thin mountain air. "The previous caretaker," I asked, trying to make conversation, "how long did he work here?" Bill stopped walking and turned to face me. In the fading light, his face looked gaunt, almost haunted. "There have been several caretakers over the years. None of them stayed very long." "Oh? Why's that?" He resumed walking, faster now. "Different reasons. The isolation gets to some people. Others." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Just make sure you keep the radio on at night. Weather service broadcasts emergency information, and sometimes you need to know what's happening out there." We reached the caretaker's quarters, a modest 2-bedroom cabin situated at the far end of the property, away from the main lodge. Bill handed me a massive ring of keys and a detailed maintenance schedule. "The Hendersons, they own the place, they'll call once a week to check in. Otherwise, you're on your own until April." He paused at the door of his truck, loaded with boxes and suitcases. "One more thing. The storage room in the basement of the main lodge, it's locked for a reason. Don't go in there." "What's in it?" "Nothing you need to worry about. Just trust me on this one." With that cryptic warning, Bill drove away, his taillights disappearing into the gathering darkness. I stood alone in the parking lot, surrounded by empty buildings and the sound of wind moving through the pines. The first snowflakes began to fall. The first week passed uneventfully. I established a routine, checking the buildings each morning, testing the heating systems, clearing snow from the walkways, and maintaining the equipment. The work was straightforward, and I found the solitude oddly comforting after the chaos of my recent divorce. But as the days grew shorter and the snow piled deeper, I began to notice things that made me uneasy. It started with the footprints. I discovered them on my 8th day, during my morning rounds. Fresh tracks in the snow, leading from the tree line to the main lodge and then circling the building. They were human footprints, large, deep impressions made by heavy boots. But they didn't match any of my tracks, and there were no vehicles in the parking lot except my own truck. I followed the prints as they wound around the lodge, past the shuttered restaurant and the empty gift shop. They led to the basement entrance, a heavy wooden door that I'd never had reason to open. The tracks stopped right at the door, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. I tried the handle. Locked. According to my key ring, I didn't have a key for this particular door. I made a mental note to ask the Hendersons about it during their next call. That night, I was awakened by the sound of footsteps on the wooden walkway outside my cabin. Heavy, deliberate steps that paused just outside my bedroom window. I lay in bed, barely breathing, listening to the silence that followed. After what felt like hours, I worked up the courage to look outside. Nothing. Just my own tracks from earlier in the day and the undisturbed snow beyond. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time they led from the main lodge to my cabin, circling it twice before heading back into the forest. The pattern was always the same: heavy boots, deliberate steps, and no other sign of human presence. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe someone from the nearby town was checking on the property. But the nearest town was 20 miles away down a winding mountain road, and the footprints always appeared at night, in the fresh snow that fell after I'd gone to bed. On the 10th night, I decided to stay awake and watch. I positioned myself at the living room window with a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in stark black and white. The snow reflected the moonlight, making the landscape bright enough to see clearly. At 2:17 a.m., I saw movement at the tree line. A figure emerged from between the pines, tall, wearing a dark coat and heavy boots. It moved with purpose, walking directly toward the main lodge without hesitation. I grabbed my binoculars, trying to get a better look at the person's face, but they wore a hood that cast their features in deep shadow. The figure circled the lodge once, just as the footprints indicated, then headed straight for my cabin. My heart hammered as I watched it approach, moving with an odd, shambling gait that didn't look quite right. It stopped directly in front of my window. I held my breath, certain that at any moment it would look up and see me watching. Instead, it stood motionless for several minutes, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, without warning, it raised its head and looked directly at my window. I couldn't see its face in the shadow of the hood, but I could feel its gaze like a physical weight. We stared at each other across the snowy yard, predator and prey in a moment of mutual recognition. Then the figure turned and walked back toward the forest, disappearing between the trees as suddenly as it had appeared. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, the footprints were there as expected, but something else was different. My truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but it wouldn't catch. I popped the hood and found the problem immediately: someone had cut the spark plug wires. I was stranded. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was 20 miles from the nearest town, in the middle of a mountain wilderness, with no transportation and no way to call for help. The resort's landline had been disconnected for the winter, and my cell phone showed no signal. I had a two-way radio for emergencies, but it only reached the weather service and the local sheriff's department. I tried both frequencies, but got only static in response. The mountains blocked most radio signals, and the weather service had warned of atmospheric interference from an approaching storm system. I was completely isolated. That afternoon, I made a thorough inventory of my supplies. I had enough food for several weeks, plenty of propane for heat and cooking, and a generator for backup power. If I rationed carefully, I could survive until spring if necessary. But the thought of spending months alone with my mysterious nighttime visitor made my skin crawl. I decided to fortify my position. I moved furniture against the doors and windows of my cabin, creating barricades that would at least slow down an intruder. I kept a flashlight, a baseball bat, and my radio within arm's reach at all times. That night, the visitor returned. This time, instead of just circling the buildings, it approached my cabin directly. Through the barricaded window, I watched as it examined my makeshift fortifications, running its hands along the boards I'd nailed over the glass. The sound of its fingers scraping against the wood was like nails on a chalkboard. It moved to the door and tried the handle. When it found the door locked and barricaded, it began to knock, slow, rhythmic raps that echoed through the cabin. Knock. 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 Then silence. Then 3 more knocks. I crouched behind my overturned couch, baseball bat in hand, trying to control my breathing. The knocking continued for nearly an hour before it finally stopped. When I looked outside the next morning, I found deep gouges in the wooden door, as if something had been trying to claw its way inside. The pattern continued for the next week. Each night, the visitor would arrive and spend increasingly long periods trying to get into my cabin. It would circle the building, test the windows and doors, and leave those disturbing scratch marks on any surface it could reach. During the day, I tried to repair my truck, but whoever had sabotaged it had done a thorough job. The wiring harness was destroyed, the battery cables were cut, and someone had poured sand into the gas tank. It would take professional repairs to get it running again. I also noticed other signs of sabotage around the property. The generator shed had been broken into, and several fuel lines had been cut. The propane tanks had been tampered with, not enough to cause an explosion, but enough to ensure they wouldn't function properly when I needed them most. Someone was systematically isolating me, cutting off my escape routes and resources one by one. On the 18th night, things escalated. I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. One of the windows in the main lodge had been shattered. I could hear footsteps inside the building, moving through the empty restaurant and lobby. Whoever was in there wasn't trying to be quiet, they wanted me to know they were there. I grabbed my radio and tried again to reach the outside world. Nothing but static. The storm that had been threatening for days was finally moving in, and the atmospheric interference was getting worse. The sounds from the lodge continued for hours. Furniture being moved. Doors slamming. At one point, I heard what sounded like someone running up and down the stairs. But the most disturbing sound was the laughter, high-pitched, gleeful laughter that echoed through the empty building and carried across the snow to my cabin. When morning came, I found the lodge in shambles. Furniture had been overturned, pictures torn from the walls, and obscene graffiti scrawled across the expensive wood paneling. But the most disturbing discovery was in the lobby. Someone had used what looked like charcoal to write a message on the white stone fireplace: "You can't hide forever." I was no longer dealing with a simple trespasser. This was someone who wanted to terrorize me, to drive me to the edge of sanity. The question was why. I spent that day researching the history of Whitmore Resort, looking through old newspapers and records I found in the lodge's office. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The resort had a dark history that the current owners had tried to bury. In 1987, a winter caretaker named Michael Garrett had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His body was never found, but his cabin was discovered in ruins, with signs of a violent struggle. In 1993, another caretaker, James Morrison, was found dead in the basement of the main lodge, apparently from a fall down the stairs. But the coroner's report noted that his injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. There were defensive wounds on his hands and arms, suggesting he'd been fighting for his life. The most disturbing case was from 1999. Sarah Chen, the resort's first female caretaker, lasted only 3 weeks before she was found wandering the mountain highway in a state of complete psychological breakdown. She claimed that someone had been stalking her, leaving threatening messages and trying to break into her cabin every night. She was committed to a psychiatric facility and died there 2 years later, still insisting that something evil lived in the mountains around Whitmore Resort. The pattern was clear. Every few years, the resort would hire a new winter caretaker. And every few years, that person would either disappear, die under suspicious circumstances, or suffer a complete mental breakdown. I was next in line. As the sun set on my 19th day at Whitmore, I realized I had two choices: I could wait for whatever was hunting me to finally catch me, or I could go on the offensive. I chose to fight. I spent the afternoon preparing. I gathered every tool I could find: hammers, screwdrivers, kitchen knives, even a chainsaw from the maintenance shed. I barricaded myself in the main lodge, figuring that the larger building would give me more room to maneuver and more escape routes if things went wrong. I positioned myself in the lobby, with my back to the stone fireplace and a clear view of all the entrances. Then I waited. My stalker arrived at the usual time, just after 2 a.m. But this time, instead of circling the building and testing the doors, it came straight for the main entrance. I heard the sound of breaking glass as it smashed through the front door, then heavy footsteps moving through the reception area. "I know you're in there," a voice called out. It was male, gravelly, with an accent I couldn't place. Come out, wherever you are." The footsteps moved closer. I could hear him breathing, a wet, raspy sound that suggested serious lung damage. The beam of a flashlight swept across the walls, getting closer to my hiding spot behind the reception desk. "You can't hide forever," he said, echoing the message on the fireplace. They all tried to hide. Garrett tried to hide. Morrison tried to hide. The girl tried to hide. But I found them all, just like I'll find you. My heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it. The flashlight beam swept over the desk, just inches from where I crouched. I gripped the baseball bat with sweaty hands, ready to make my move. 20 years I've been coming here," the voice continued, getting closer. 20 years of winter caretakers who thought they could ignore me, pretend I didn't exist. But I'm part of this place now. I belong here more than any of you ever did." The footsteps stopped right beside my hiding place. I could smell him now, a mixture of unwashed clothes, tobacco, and something else. Something rotten. "Found you," he whispered. I exploded from behind the desk, swinging the bat with all my strength. It connected with something solid, and my attacker stumbled backward with a grunt of pain. In the beam of his dropped flashlight, I got my first clear look at him. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a tattered military jacket and heavy boots. His face was a horror show, half of it was normal, weathered but human. The other half was a mass of scar tissue and twisted flesh, as if he'd been burned or frozen. One eye was missing entirely, leaving just an empty socket that seemed to stare at me with malevolent intelligence. "You shouldn't have done that," he growled, blood running from his nose where I'd hit him. "Now I'm going to have to hurt you." He lunged at me with surprising speed, but I was ready. I dodged to the side and swung the bat again, catching him in the ribs. He doubled over, gasping, and I ran for the stairs. He followed, shouting obscenities and threats. I could hear him climbing behind me, his boots pounding on the wooden steps. I reached the second floor and kept running, looking for a place to make a stand. The chase continued through the empty hallways and abandoned guest rooms. He was persistent, I'll give him that. Every time I thought I'd lost him, he'd appear again, limping but determined. The cat and mouse game went on for hours, with both of us growing increasingly exhausted. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, he seemed to give up. I heard his footsteps retreating, then the sound of the front door slamming. When I looked out the window, I saw him walking back toward the forest, but he stopped at the tree line and turned back toward the lodge. Even at that distance, I could feel his one good eye staring at me. Then he raised his hand and pointed directly at me. The message was clear, this wasn't over. I spent the next day trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted. Based on his age and the military jacket, I guessed he was a Vietnam veteran, probably someone who'd been living rough in the mountains for years. But that didn't explain his obsession with the resort or his systematic campaign against the winter caretakers. The answer came to me while I was reading through more old records. In 1985, 2 years before the first caretaker disappeared, there had been an incident at the resort. A homeless veteran named Thomas Brennan had been caught breaking into guest cabins, stealing food and supplies. When security confronted him, there had been a fight. Brennan fell down a rocky slope, suffering severe head and facial injuries. The resort owners had him arrested and charged with trespassing and theft. He spent 6 months in jail, then disappeared. According to the police report, he'd threatened to make them pay for what they'd done to him. Thomas Brennan. My stalker had a name. But knowing who he was didn't make him any less dangerous. If anything, it made him more frightening. This was a man who'd been nursing a grudge for over 20 years, taking his revenge on innocent caretakers who had nothing to do with his original grievance. That night, he returned with reinforcements. I first noticed the additional footprints in the snow, at least 3 more sets, all leading toward the lodge. Brennan had recruited other mountain dwellers, other outcasts and criminals who'd found refuge in the wilderness. They surrounded the building, testing every door and window. I could hear them whispering to each other, coordinating their attack. This time, they weren't just trying to scare me. They were coming in. I made a desperate decision. I grabbed my radio and broadcast on the emergency frequency, not caring if anyone was listening. Mayday, Mayday, this is Whitmore Mountain Resort. I'm under attack by multiple armed intruders. Request immediate assistance. GPS coordinates. I rattled off the numbers I'd memorized from the resort's emergency procedures. The response was immediate. This is Colorado State Patrol. We copy your mayday. Units are en route, but weather conditions are severe. ETA approximately 4 hours. 4 hours. I had to survive 4 more hours. The attack began with a coordinated assault on the ground floor. They broke through 3 different entrances simultaneously, forcing me to retreat to the upper floors. I could hear them moving through the building below me, calling out to each other as they searched. Check the kitchen, Brennan's voice echoed up the stairwell. He's got to be up there somewhere. I moved from room to room, trying to stay ahead of them. But they knew the building as well as I did, and they were systematically cutting off my escape routes. Soon, I was trapped on the 3rd floor with nowhere else to go. That's when I remembered the storage room in the basement, the one Bill had warned me never to enter. Maybe there was something down there I could use as a weapon, or another way out of the building. I waited until they were all on the 2nd floor, then made my move. I slipped down the back stairs and headed for the basement. The door was still locked, But I'd learned a few things about breaking and entering during my weeks at the resort. The storage room was larger than I'd expected, filled with old furniture and equipment covered in dusty tarps. But in the back corner, I found something that made my blood run cold. Human bones. Lots of them. Scattered across the floor like discarded toys. These weren't ancient remains. Some still had bits of clothing attached. I recognized a watch that had belonged to Michael Garrett. I'd seen it in the missing person report. There was a woman's jacket that looked like the one Sarah Chen had been wearing in her employee photo. Brennan hadn't just been terrorizing the caretakers. He'd been killing them and storing their remains in the basement. The resort owners had known about it, they'd had to know, but they'd covered it up to protect their business. I heard footsteps on the stairs above me. They'd figured out where I'd gone. Basement, Brennan's voice carried down the stairwell. He's in the basement. I looked around desperately for another exit, but there was only one way out of the room. I was trapped with the bones of Brennan's previous victims, waiting to join them. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. I could see flashlight beams moving through the crack under the door. "Open it," Brennan ordered. The door handle turned. I pressed myself against the wall behind a stack of old chairs, hoping the shadows would hide me. The door swung open, and 3 figures entered the room. Brennan was in the lead, carrying a hunting rifle. Behind him were 2 other men, one young and nervous, the other older with prison tattoos covering his arms. They moved into the room cautiously, their flashlights sweeping back and forth. "Look at this," the young one whispered, staring at the scattered bones. "Jesus, Tommy, how many people have you killed?" "As many as it takes," Brennan replied coldly. "This is my mountain. They're trespassing on my land." "You're insane," the tattooed man said. "This is murder, not some territorial dispute." Brennan spun around and pointed the rifle at his companion. "You got a problem with how I do things, Earl? Because I can add you to the collection." While they argued, I made my move. I grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox and hurled it at the nearest flashlight. The room plunged into darkness as the light shattered. In the chaos that followed, I heard gunshots, shouting, and the sound of someone falling. I stayed low and moved toward the door, using the confusion to cover my escape. I made it halfway up the stairs before Brennan's flashlight found me. "There he is!" he shouted. "Don't let him get away." I ran for my life, taking the stairs 3 at a time. Behind me, I could hear them giving chase, but the darkness was working in my favor. I knew the building better than his companions did, and I used that knowledge to stay ahead of them. I reached the main floor and headed for the front entrance, but Brennan had anticipated my move. He was waiting by the door, rifle raised. "End of the line," he said, his scarred face twisted into a savage grin. "You've caused me a lot of trouble tonight." "The police are coming," I told him. "They'll be here any minute." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Police don't come up here in winter. Roads are too dangerous. It'll be spring before anyone finds your body." He was probably right. The storm outside was getting worse, and the mountain roads would be impassable by now. But I had to try to keep him talking, to buy myself time. "Why do you do this?" I asked. "These people never hurt you." His expression darkened. "They hurt me by being here. This place took everything from me, my face, my freedom, my future. So I take everything from them. The resort owners are the ones who hurt you, not the caretakers. The caretakers work for them. They're all guilty." He raised the rifle to his shoulder, aiming at my chest. I closed my eyes and prepared for the end. The shot never came. Instead, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. Brennan heard them too, and his expression changed from confidence to panic. "That's impossible," he muttered. "They can't be here yet." The sirens grew louder, and I could see flashing lights through the windows. The cavalry had arrived, and they'd made better time than expected. Brennan backed toward the rear exit, keeping the rifle trained on me. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll be back. I always come back." He disappeared into the darkness just as the front door burst open. Colorado State Patrol officers flooded into the building, Their weapons drawn and their radios crackling with chatter. "Hands where we can see them," the lead officer shouted. I raised my hands, never happier to be arrested in my life. The aftermath was like something out of a nightmare. The police found the remains of 6 people in the basement storage room, all former winter caretakers who'd been reported missing over the years. The resort owners were arrested as accessories after the fact. They'd known about Brennan's activities but had covered them up to avoid scandal. Brennan himself was never caught. Despite a massive manhunt that lasted for weeks, he simply vanished into the wilderness. The police believe he died in the mountains during the storm, but his body was never found. I testified at the trial of the resort owners, describing everything I'd witnessed during my 3 weeks at Whitmore. They were convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy and obstruction of justice, and the resort was permanently closed. But sometimes, on quiet winter nights, I still dream about those mountains. I dream about footprints in the snow, about scratching at my door, and about a scarred face staring at me from the darkness. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if Thomas Brennan really died in that storm. Or if he's still out there, waiting for the next caretaker who thinks they can survive alone in his mountains. The job posting for Whitmore Resort has never appeared again. The buildings stand empty now, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. But local hikers report strange sightings in the area, a figure in a military jacket watching them from the tree line, footprints that appear overnight in fresh snow, and the sound of laughter echoing through the empty valleys. They say the mountains never forget. And neither do the monsters who call them home. I learned that lesson the hard way, during the longest 3 weeks of my life. I survived Thomas Brennan's mountain, but I left a part of myself there among the snow and shadows. A part that still wakes up in the middle of the night, listening for footsteps on the wooden walkway outside my window. The job as winter caretaker at Whitmore Mountain Resort paid well, just like the posting promised. But some jobs cost more than money. Some jobs cost pieces of your soul that you can never get back. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling and the snow is falling, I can still hear Thomas Brennan's voice echoing across the years, "You can't hide forever." He was right about that. You can't hide forever. But you can survive. And sometimes, survival is the only victory that matters.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.